I'm Sydney Doncaster, 32, and I worked my way up to serving in the military police, a career built on discipline, truth, and protecting people who can't protect themselves. For years, I sent money home to help my mom keep the lights on, trusting my father's business trips were exactly what he said they were. But when I came home unannounced and found her hiding fresh bruises while he was laughing on a yacht with his mistress, I made a decision that changed everything. Have you ever been betrayed by someone you gave everything to? If you have, share your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I tell you what happened, drop where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to stand your ground after being wronged, hit like and subscribe for more true stories about setting boundaries and taking back your power. What happened next might surprise you. I learned early that some people shine brighter when they're standing in someone else's shadow. My father was one of those people. Growing up, he filled our house with stories of boardroom victories and client conquests, his voice carrying through the hallways like he was addressing shareholders instead of his family. Mom would listen from the kitchen, nodding at the right moments, asking the questions that made him feel important. I absorbed it all from the living room floor, homework spread around me, thinking this was what success looked like. Dad traveled constantly. Chicago one week, Denver the next, sometimes overseas for what he called critical negotiations. His absence became the family rhythm. Mom handled parent-teacher conferences alone, signed permission slips in her careful handwriting, drove me to every soccer game and school play. When other kids asked where my father was, I'd repeat his phrases, important business meeting or closing a major deal. I believed it completely. The house ran on Mom's energy. She paid bills at the kitchen table every Sunday morning, calculator clicking while she sorted envelopes into neat piles. She knew which neighbors needed their groceries carried upstairs, which teachers at my school were going through divorces, which local businesses were struggling. Dad knew stock prices and contract terms. Mom knew people. When he was home, usually for 3 or 4 days between trips, Dad would settle into his recliner with financial reports and conference calls. Mom would cook his favorite meals, ask about his travels, laugh at stories she'd probably heard variations of before. She never complained about managing everything alone, never mentioned the leaky faucet in the guest bathroom or the weird noise the heating system made at night. She'd save those problems for when he left again. I started noticing the pattern in middle school. Dad would arrive with expensive gifts, jewelry for Mom, electronics for me, and stories about the restaurants he'd visited and hotels where he'd stayed. Mom would wear the jewelry once, usually to church the following Sunday, then carefully put it away in her jewelry box. The electronics would sit in their boxes until I figured out how to set them up myself. The house felt different when he was gone. Quieter, but somehow more alive. Mom would play music while she cooked, sing along to old songs from before I was born. She'd ask about my day and actually wait for the full answer. We'd watch movies together, pause them to discuss plot holes or debate whether the main character was making smart choices. During Dad's business trips, I felt like I had a real relationship with my mother. When he returned, she'd become more careful, more measured, like she was performing a role she'd studied but never quite mastered. By high school, I'd decided I wanted to be like him. Success meant independence, meant having others depend on you rather than the reverse. I studied hard, played sports, participated in activities that would look good on college applications. Dad would show up to maybe 1 game per season, usually taking work calls from the bleachers. Mom attended everything, cheering loud enough for both parents. When I told them I was considering military service, Dad immediately started calculating the career advantages. Military experience looks excellent on a resume, he said, already mentally drafting the stories he'd tell his business associates. Shows leadership, discipline, character. Mom asked different questions. Was I sure this was what I wanted? Had I considered all the alternatives? Would I be safe? Military police training taught me to notice details other people missed. How someone stands when they're lying. The difference between nervousness and guilt. Which stories change when you ask the same question twice. I became skilled at reading situations, at seeing through surface presentations to underlying truths. These skills made me good at my job, but they also made me more observant when I came home on leave. Dad's business trips were getting longer. 6 weeks instead of 4. 2 months instead of 6 weeks. Mom would mention it casually, like she was discussing weather patterns, but I started noticing things she didn't say. How she'd pause before answering questions about when he'd be back. How she'd change the subject when I asked about specific details of his work. How she'd gotten better at managing everything alone, but in a way that suggested she'd stopped expecting help. I began sending money home during my second year of service. Not much at first, just enough to help with groceries or utilities. Mom protested, insisting they didn't need financial assistance, but I kept sending checks anyway. Dad never mentioned the money, never acknowledged that his daughter was contributing to household expenses while he was supposedly earning enough to support the family with his business success. The money became a point of pride for me and a source of quiet tension I couldn't quite name. I was taking care of Mom in a way that felt necessary, but I couldn't articulate why it felt necessary. Dad was successful, wasn't he? He had important clients, major deals, business connections that required constant attention. Why did I feel like Mom was being left behind? When Dad's colleagues would ask about me during his rare appearances at local business events, he'd launch into detailed descriptions of my military career. He knew my rank, my training specializations, my deployment schedule. He could recite my achievements to anyone who'd listen. But when I'd call home, and he'd happen to answer the phone, our conversations were brief and surface level. He'd ask if I was staying safe and eating well, then hand the phone to Mom for the real conversation. I began to understand that Dad knew a lot about my life without actually knowing me. He could describe my career trajectory to impress other people, but he couldn't tell you my favorite foods or which movies made me laugh or what I worried about late at night. Mom knew all of that. Mom remembered details from letters I'd written months earlier, asked follow-up questions about friends I'd mentioned, sent care packages with items she knew I needed before I knew I needed them. The disparity should have bothered me more than it did. Instead, it felt normal, predictable. Dad was busy with important work. Mom was the parent who handled personal relationships, emotional support, daily life maintenance. This division of labor seemed efficient, practical, reasonable. I didn't question it because I didn't know what questions to ask. Looking back, I realize I was already becoming the kind of person who notices inconsistencies, but doesn't always know what to do with them. Military training had taught me to observe, analyze, and act decisively when action was required. But family relationships aren't military operations. You can't just identify a problem and implement a solution. Some problems require patience, careful consideration, and an understanding that not all conflicts have clear resolutions. I thought I understood my family's dynamics. I thought I knew who my parents were and how they related to each other and to me. I thought Dad's success justified his absence, and Mom's contentment justified her acceptance of that absence. I thought I was part of a functional family system where everyone played their assigned roles competently and willingly. I had no idea how wrong I was about almost everything. The first crack in my understanding appeared during a video call with Mom. She was sitting in the kitchen, afternoon light streaming through windows she'd cleaned that morning, and something about her face looked different. Tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix. When I asked how she was doing, she smiled and said, "Oh, keeping busy." But the smile didn't reach her eyes, and she kept touching her left temple like it was bothering her. Dad's social media presence had evolved from occasional business updates to frequent travel photos. Restaurants I'd never heard of in cities where he claimed to be meeting clients. Hotel pools and beach views that seemed more vacation than business trip. I started scrolling through his posts during my downtime, initially just curious about his work, gradually becoming more suspicious about his activities. The photos were too polished, too leisurely. Business trips involve conference rooms and handshakes and promotional materials with company logos. Dad's photos featured sunset dinners and wine tastings and golf courses. When I asked Mom about specific trips, her answers were vague. He mentioned something about expanding into new markets or there's some kind of partnership he's exploring. She never had concrete details about his business activities, and I was beginning to suspect that was because he wasn't sharing those details with her. During my next leave, I spent more time observing Mom's daily routine. She'd developed habits that suggested she was managing everything alone for extended periods. Grocery shopping once a week with military precision, buying exactly what she needed for 7 days. Bills organized in a system that allowed her to handle finances without consulting anyone else. A social calendar that revolved around activities she could attend by herself: book club, volunteer work at the library, coffee with neighbors who also had absent husbands. She'd gotten good at being alone, but not in a way that suggested she enjoyed it. More like she'd adapted to circumstances she couldn't control. When I offered to help with household repairs, she'd initially protest, then gratefully accept assistance with projects that had been waiting months for attention. The guest bathroom faucet still leaked. The heating system still made concerning noises at night. Dad apparently wasn't addressing these problems during his brief visits home. I began timing my calls to coincide with Dad's supposed travel schedule. When he was allegedly in important meetings, I'd ask Mom specific questions about his work. Which companies was he visiting? What kind of partnerships was he developing? How long would he be gone this time? Her answers became increasingly uncomfortable, full of qualifiers and uncertainty. He mentioned something about West Coast clients, but I might be remembering wrong, or I think he said 2 weeks, but you know how these things can change. Mom had always been precise about details. She could remember conversation fragments from months earlier, could recite schedules and appointments and commitments with remarkable accuracy. Her sudden vagueness about Dad's work felt deliberate, like she was protecting herself from acknowledging something she didn't want to confront. The expensive jewelry appeared around the same time Dad's trips extended to 2 and 3 months. Beautiful pieces that Mom would wear exactly once before storing them carefully away. When I complimented a necklace she'd worn to church, she'd say, "Your father picked it out," but she couldn't tell me where he'd bought it or what occasion had prompted the gift. The jewelry felt like apologies, and I started wondering what he was apologizing for. His social media posts during these extended absences told a different story than the one he was sharing at home. Photos of restaurant meals for 2. Hotel room views that suggested romantic getaways rather than business accommodations. Beach photos taken during weekdays when he should have been in conference rooms. And increasingly, the same woman appearing in background shots standing near him at hotel bars, visible in restaurant reflections, walking beside him in blurry vacation photos he'd cropped carelessly. She was younger than Mom, dressed in clothes that suggested someone was paying for her lifestyle, always smiling in a way that indicated she was enjoying herself immensely. She appeared so frequently that I started screenshotting Dad's posts, creating a timeline of their appearances together. 3 months in Miami. 6 weeks in California. A month-long trip to Europe that Dad had described to Mom as expanding international partnerships. I didn't share my discoveries with Mom immediately. Military training teaches you to gather evidence before drawing conclusions, to analyze patterns before taking action. But the evidence was accumulating rapidly, and the patterns were becoming impossible to ignore. Dad wasn't just traveling for business. He wasn't just absent from family life due to professional demands. He was living a double life, maintaining a relationship with another woman while leaving Mom to manage our household alone. The realization should have made me angry, but instead I felt something colder and more calculating. Anger burns out quickly and leads to impulsive decisions. What I felt was more like strategic assessment, the mental state I'd learned to cultivate when dealing with complex problems that required careful planning. Dad had been lying to our family for months, possibly years. Mom was either unaware of his deception or unwilling to acknowledge it directly. I needed to decide what to do with this information. Confronting him directly seemed pointless. People who maintain elaborate deceptions for extended periods are skilled at deflecting accusations and redirecting blame. Confronting Mom felt cruel. She was already dealing with the emotional consequences of his absence, whether or not she fully understood its cause. But doing nothing meant allowing the situation to continue indefinitely, and I was beginning to understand that Mom's increasing isolation and Dad's financial extravagance were connected in ways that couldn't be sustained forever. I started making phone calls to people who might have insights about Dad's business activities. Former colleagues, family friends, professional associates who might know whether his travel stories corresponded to any legitimate work. The responses were consistently vague and diplomatically evasive. Nobody wanted to directly contradict his claims, but nobody could confirm them either. Dad's business success, it seemed, was as carefully constructed a fiction as his faithful husband persona. The surprise visit wasn't planned as an investigation. I'd gotten unexpected leave and decided to drive home without calling ahead, wanting to surprise Mom with extra time together. I'd been looking forward to seeing her face when I walked through the door, imagining how we'd spend the afternoon catching up and planning activities for the few days I could stay. She answered the door slowly, opening it just wide enough to see who was visiting. When she realized it was me, her expression shifted through several emotions, quickly surprise, joy, then something that looked like panic before settling into a forced smile. "Honey, what are you doing here?" she said, stepping back to let me inside, but moving carefully, like she was protecting something. The bruise was visible as soon as she turned toward the kitchen light. Dark purple along her left cheekbone, fresh enough that makeup hadn't been able to cover it completely. She was holding her left arm slightly away from her body, the way people do when they're trying to avoid putting pressure on an injury. I set my bag down and asked the obvious question, "Mom, what happened to your face?" She touched her cheek reflexively, then immediately dropped her hand. "I just fell," she said, eyes focused on the floor. "You know how clumsy I get when I'm rushing around." Hit the corner of the cabinet door. Her voice was steady but rehearsed, like she'd been practicing the explanation. I could have pressed for details. Military police training teaches you to identify inconsistencies in people's stories, to ask follow-up questions that reveal whether someone is telling the truth. But something about Mom's posture told me that pushing for information would cause more harm than clarification. She was protecting herself in the only way she knew how, and I needed to respect that while figuring out how to help her. Instead, I asked if she needed medical attention. She insisted she was fine, just embarrassed about being so careless. I offered to make tea, to help with whatever she'd been working on before I arrived, to do anything that would keep us in the same room while I assessed the situation more thoroughly. While she moved around the kitchen, I noticed other details. The way she favored her left side. How she avoided raising her arm above shoulder height. The careful way she sat down, like she was protecting injured ribs. These weren't injuries from falling into a cabinet door. Someone had hurt her deliberately and recently. I waited until she was comfortable with tea before asking about Dad's travel schedule. When would he be back from his current business trip? How was his work going? Did he call regularly to check in? Her answers were even more vague than usual, full of "I think," and "probably," and "he mentioned something about." She seemed genuinely uncertain about his schedule, his location, his plans for returning home. That evening, after Mom went to bed early claiming she was tired from her fall, I sat in my childhood bedroom with my phone and opened Dad's social media accounts. The most recent posts were time-stamped from earlier that day. Videos of him on a yacht, laughing and raising champagne glasses with the woman who'd been appearing in his photos for months. They were clearly celebrating something, both of them relaxed and affectionate in a way that suggested intimate familiarity. The yacht looked expensive, anchored in what appeared to be a tropical location with crystal-clear water and palm trees visible in the background. Dad was wearing clothes I'd never seen before, designer casual wear that probably cost more than Mom's monthly grocery budget. The woman was in a bikini that matched her designer accessories, everything about her appearance suggesting she was accustomed to luxury. While Mom was home with fresh bruises, making excuses about clumsiness and cabinet doors, Dad was living like a wealthy bachelor with no family responsibilities. The contrast was so stark it felt surreal. I screenshotted everything, creating a record of his activities on the same day my mother had been injured. I couldn't sleep that night. Instead, I scrolled through months of his social media posts, documenting the timeline of his relationship with this other woman. Beach vacations while Mom handled household emergencies alone. Expensive restaurants while she stretched grocery budgets to cover bills. Romantic getaways while she made excuses for his absence to neighbors and friends. The financial implications were becoming clear. Dad's extravagant lifestyle with his girlfriend required money that should have been supporting our household. Mom's increasing reliance on my financial contributions, her careful budgeting, her reluctance to make necessary household repairs, all of this was connected to his decision to prioritize another relationship over his marriage. But the bruises suggested something worse than financial neglect. Someone had hurt Mom physically, and the most likely candidate was the person who'd been lying to her for months about his whereabouts and activities. Dad's social media posts proved he was nowhere near our house when Mom sustained her injuries, but that didn't eliminate the possibility that he'd hurt her before leaving for his current vacation. The more I analyzed the situation, the angrier I became. Not the hot, impulsive anger that leads to shouting matches and dramatic confrontations, but the cold, focused anger that develops when you realize someone you trusted has been systematically deceiving and harming people you care about. Dad wasn't just having an affair. He was stealing money from our family's resources to fund his lifestyle with another woman while leaving Mom vulnerable and isolated. Military training had taught me that some problems require immediate tactical responses, while others require strategic planning and careful execution. This was clearly a strategic situation. Dad had been building his deception for months or years, creating financial arrangements and personal relationships that wouldn't be easily disrupted. Mom was emotionally and possibly physically trapped in a situation she might not know how to escape. I needed to gather more information before taking any action. But I also needed to ensure Mom's immediate safety and let her know she wasn't as alone as she might feel. Whatever had happened to cause her injuries, it couldn't happen again. And whatever financial or emotional manipulation Dad was using to maintain his double life needed to be exposed and stopped. Lying in my childhood bedroom, looking at photos of my father celebrating with another woman while my mother nursed bruises in the next room, I began planning the most important mission of my military career. The next morning, Mom moved around the kitchen like someone who'd forgotten she was injured, then caught herself and slowed down when she remembered her ribs were tender. She'd covered the bruise on her face with makeup, but the concealer was too pale and obvious in the morning light. When I asked how she'd slept, she said, "Fine, honey," in a voice that suggested she hadn't slept much at all. I offered to help with breakfast, partly to be useful and partly to observe her movements more carefully. She was definitely protecting her left side, and there were additional bruises on her arms that hadn't been visible the night before. Small, finger-shaped marks that someone might dismiss as normal wear and tear unless they knew what to look for. Military police training includes recognizing signs of domestic violence. The injury patterns, the rehearsed explanations, the victim's reluctance to provide details or seek help, everything about Mom's behavior fit profiles I'd studied in professional contexts. But knowing the signs intellectually and seeing them on your own mother are entirely different experiences. I didn't push for more information about her injuries. Instead, I asked about practical matters. Had she been eating regularly? Were there household tasks I could help with? Did she need anything from town while I was visiting? Normal questions that would give her opportunities to share information if she was ready, without making her feel pressured or interrogated. During the day, I noticed other details that suggested Mom had been managing crisis situations alone. Financial documents spread across the kitchen table, bills marked final notice, and bank statements with highlighted entries. A notebook where she'd been tracking expenses and calculating payment schedules. Her careful budgeting wasn't just about being financially responsible. She was trying to prevent utilities from being shut off and creditors from demanding immediate payment. When I asked about the bills, she explained that Dad's business was going through a temporary cash flow problem. Nothing serious, just some delayed payments from clients that were affecting their household budget. She expected everything to be resolved soon, once his current business trips generated new contracts and payments. Her explanation didn't match the evidence I'd been gathering from his social media posts. Dad's expensive lifestyle with his girlfriend suggested he had access to significant money, he just wasn't using it to support our household. While Mom was rationing groceries and negotiating payment plans with utility companies, he was staying at luxury hotels and eating at restaurants that probably cost more per meal than she was spending on food per week. I spent the afternoon helping with household repairs that had been waiting for months of attention. The leaky faucet in the guest bathroom required replacement parts that cost less than Dad probably spent on drinks during a single evening with his girlfriend. The heating systems concerning noises were caused by a loose connection that took 20 minutes to fix. These weren't complicated or expensive problems, but they required time and attention that Dad apparently wasn't providing. While I worked, Mom talked about her daily routine. Book club meetings where she'd started making excuses for not hosting because she was embarrassed about the house's condition. Volunteer shifts at the library that gave her reasons to leave home and interact with other people. Coffee dates with neighbors who'd stopped asking about Dad's work because her answers were too vague to sustain conversation. She'd constructed a life that accommodated his absence, but it was a smaller, more isolated life than she'd lived when I was growing up. She was managing everything competently, but she was managing it alone in ways that suggested she'd stopped expecting partnership or support. That evening, after we'd had dinner and she'd gone to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with her financial documents and tried to understand the full scope of the situation. The bills weren't just past due, some were months behind. Credit card statements showed minimum payments, barely keeping accounts current. Bank statements revealed a pattern of deposits, my monthly contributions being used immediately for urgent expenses. Dad's financial abandonment was systematic and deliberate. He was maintaining his lifestyle with his girlfriend while leaving Mom responsible for all household expenses. She was using my military pay to cover necessities while he used his income for luxuries he shared with another woman. I started making phone calls to people who might have information about Dad's actual financial situation. Military connections had taught me to build networks of reliable contacts, people who could provide accurate information when you needed to understand complex situations quickly. By late evening, I'd learned enough to confirm my suspicions. Dad's business wasn't experiencing temporary cash flow problems. He'd been systematically moving money from joint accounts to personal accounts Mom didn't have access to. He'd been presenting one financial picture to her while maintaining entirely different financial arrangements for his other relationship. The pattern of deception was comprehensive and calculating. He wasn't just having an affair. He was stealing from his wife to fund his affair while leaving her to manage the consequences of his financial abandonment. Mom's injuries were part of this larger pattern of abuse, physical violence being used to maintain emotional and economic control. I needed to talk to someone who could help me understand my legal and practical options. Military legal services could provide guidance about evidence gathering and documentation. Civilian contacts could explain what resources were available for domestic violence situations. But I also needed to ensure that whatever actions I took would actually help Mom rather than escalating the danger she was already facing. The most important realization was that this situation had been building for longer than I'd initially understood. Dad's extended travel schedule wasn't recent development. It was a systematic strategy for maintaining his double life while keeping Mom isolated and financially dependent. His gifts of expensive jewelry weren't spontaneous gestures of affection. They were calculated attempts to prevent her from questioning his absences or demanding more transparency about his activities. Mom wasn't just a victim of adultery or financial neglect. She was being systematically abused by someone who'd spent years creating conditions that made it difficult for her to seek help or escape. His control was subtle, but comprehensive: financial manipulation, social isolation, and physical intimidation designed to make her feel like she had no alternatives to accepting his treatment. I was beginning to understand that helping Mom would require more than just exposing Dad's lies or confronting him about his behavior. It would require careful planning, professional guidance, and strategic action designed to disrupt his control while protecting her from retaliation. I didn't sleep much that second night. Instead, I lay in bed formulating plans and discarding them, trying to identify approaches that would actually solve the problems I discovered rather than just creating different problems. Direct confrontation with Dad seemed pointless, and potentially dangerous people who systematically abuse family members don't typically respond to logical arguments about their behavior. Encouraging Mom to leave immediately felt unrealistic. She'd spent years adapting to circumstances that required her to manage everything alone, and she developed psychological coping mechanisms that made it difficult to acknowledge the full extent of what was happening to her. Asking her to suddenly abandon strategies that had helped her survive would be cruel and probably ineffective. But allowing the situation to continue indefinitely wasn't acceptable either. Dad's financial abuse was escalating, and Mom's physical injuries suggested the violence might be escalating too. Whatever action I took needed to be decisive enough to create real change, but careful enough to avoid making things worse for her. The next morning, I called a military police colleague I'd worked with on domestic violence cases. Sarah had more experience than I did with situations involving systematic abuse and financial manipulation. When I described Mom's circumstances without initially revealing the personal connection, she listened carefully and asked specific questions about the evidence I'd gathered. Documentation is crucial, she said. Financial records, medical records if possible, and evidence of the perpetrator's deception. But the most important factor is the victim's safety and autonomy. Whatever intervention you're planning, it needs to prioritize her ability to make informed choices about her own situation. When I explained that the victim was my mother, Sarah's tone became more direct. Personal involvement makes this more complicated, not easier. You're dealing with your own emotional reactions on top of the tactical considerations. That's not necessarily bad, but you need to be aware of how it might affect your judgment. She helped me think through various approaches and their likely consequences. Reporting the situation to local police might result in Dad being questioned, but probably wouldn't lead to charges unless Mom was willing to file complaints and testify about her injuries. Confronting Dad directly might prompt him to become more careful about hiding his activities, or it might escalate his violence toward Mom. The most effective interventions usually involve multiple strategies implemented simultaneously, Sarah explained. Financial documentation to establish the abuse, legal consultation to understand the victim's options, safety planning to reduce immediate danger, and emotional support to help the victim recognize that she has alternatives. After talking with Sarah, I spent the day researching domestic violence resources in Mom's area. Legal aid organizations that provided free consultation for women in abusive relationships. Financial advisors who specialized in helping women regain control of their economic situations. Support groups and counseling services designed for people recovering from systematic manipulation. I also researched Dad's business activities more thoroughly, using military investigative techniques to trace his financial arrangements and travel patterns. The information I discovered was worse than I'd initially suspected. He hadn't just been having an affair and neglecting his family financial obligations. He'd been systematically moving assets from joint accounts to accounts Mom couldn't access, creating legal and financial structures designed to leave her with no recourse if she tried to assert her rights. The yacht parties and luxury vacations weren't just evidence of infidelity. They were evidence of theft. Dad was using marital assets to fund his relationship with another woman while deliberately impoverishing his wife. The financial statements I'd found at Mom's house told only part of the story. She was struggling to pay basic bills while he was spending equivalent amounts on entertainment and gifts for his girlfriend. That evening, I tried to talk with Mom about practical matters without overwhelming her with information she might not be ready to process. Did she have access to all their bank accounts? Did she know about all their credit cards and investments? Had she consulted with anyone about their financial situation? Her answers confirmed what I'd suspected. Dad had gradually restricted her access to financial information, claiming he was protecting her from having to worry about complicated business matters. She had access to one checking account for household expenses, but she didn't know about other accounts or investments. She received credit card statements for some cards, but not others. She'd never consulted with a lawyer or financial advisor about her legal rights. He handles all the complicated stuff, she said, using the same tone she'd used when I was growing up to explain Dad's long business trips. I trust him to take care of things. But her trust was being systematically violated, and she was being financially abused in ways that might not be easy to reverse. Even if she decided to leave the marriage, Dad had apparently been preparing for that possibility by moving assets beyond her reach. I realized that helping Mom would require more than just exposing Dad's deception or encouraging her to seek help. It would require rebuilding her understanding of her own rights and options, providing her with resources and support systems she could rely on, and possibly taking direct action to disrupt Dad's control before he could cause additional harm. The challenge was accomplishing these goals without violating her autonomy or making decisions for her that she should be making herself. Military training teaches you to assess situations quickly and take decisive action, but family relationships require different skills: patience, empathy, and respect for other people's agency even when you think they're making mistakes. I decided to focus on documentation and resource gathering while continuing to provide practical support and emotional availability. If Mom eventually decided she wanted to change her situation, I could help her understand her options and access professional assistance. If she wasn't ready to make changes, at least I could ensure that evidence of Dad's abuse was preserved and that she knew she had alternatives to accepting his treatment. But I was also beginning to understand that some situations require more direct intervention, especially when the person being harmed is too isolated and manipulated to seek help effectively on their own. On my third day home, while Mom was at her volunteer shift at the library, I drove to the marina where Dad kept his yacht. I'd found the location through his social media posts, photos tagged with specific coordinates that made it easy to identify the dock. I wanted to see the boat in person, to understand the scope of his financial deception more completely. The yacht was larger and more expensive than I'd realized from the photos. 60 feet at least, with luxury features that probably cost more than most people's houses. The slip fees alone would represent a significant monthly expense, and maintaining a boat like this required ongoing costs that would strain most family budgets. While I was taking photos and notes, a marina employee approached and asked if I needed help finding anything. When I explained that I was looking for my father's yacht, he immediately became more talkative. "Your dad and his lady friend were just here yesterday," he said. "Nice couple, always very generous with tips. They're planning to take her out for another week or so, I think. Some kind of celebration." The casual reference to Dad's lady friend confirmed that their relationship was well established and publicly acknowledged, at least in contexts where Dad didn't expect the information to reach his family. Marina employees, restaurant staff, hotel workers, all the people who serviced his lifestyle with his girlfriend probably assumed she was his wife. I asked a few more questions and learned that Dad had been keeping the yacht at this marina for over 2 years. He and his companion visited regularly, usually for trips lasting several weeks. The marina employee knew their names, their preferred docking arrangements, and their typical travel schedule. This wasn't a new relationship or a temporary situation. It was an established alternative life that Dad had been maintaining parallel to his marriage. The financial implications were staggering. The yacht purchase, slip fees, maintenance costs, fuel, and insurance probably represented hundreds of thousands of dollars, money that should have been available for household expenses and Mom's financial security. Instead, it was being used to fund Dad's relationship with another woman while Mom struggled to pay basic bills. I spent the rest of the day gathering additional documentation. Property records that showed when Dad had purchased the yacht and how he'd financed it. Credit reports that revealed accounts Mom didn't know existed. Business registration documents that suggested he'd been creating financial structures designed to hide assets from his wife. The evidence I was accumulating painted a clear picture of systematic financial abuse designed to maintain control while funding infidelity. Dad wasn't just cheating on Mom, he was stealing from her to pay for his cheating while using psychological manipulation and physical violence to prevent her from discovering or challenging his behavior. That evening, I called Sarah again to discuss my findings and get her advice about next steps. She listened to my updated report and asked pointed questions about Mom's current safety and my plans for intervention. "You've documented extensive financial and emotional abuse," she said. "The question now is how to use that documentation most effectively. Your mother needs to understand her situation and her options, but she also needs to be protected from retaliation while she's making decisions about how to respond." We discussed various approaches, consulting with attorneys who specialized in divorce cases involving hidden assets, connecting Mom with domestic violence advocates who could provide safety planning and emotional support, and gathering additional evidence that would be useful if legal action became necessary. But Sarah also warned me about the risks of moving too quickly or taking actions that might compromise Mom's safety. Abusers often escalate their behavior when they feel their control being threatened, she explained. Whatever intervention you're planning, you need to have safety measures in place before you begin. I was beginning to understand that helping Mom effectively would require professional assistance and careful coordination among multiple resources. This wasn't a situation I could resolve through individual action, no matter how well-intentioned my efforts might be. But I was also running out of time. My leave was ending soon, and I'd be returning to duty in another state. Mom would be alone again, vulnerable to continued financial manipulation and possible physical violence, while Dad continued his double life with impunity. The evidence I'd gathered proved that Dad's abuse was systematic, ongoing, and escalating. His financial theft was becoming more sophisticated, his deception more elaborate, and his violence more frequent. Mom's injuries were recent, but the pattern of behavior that had led to those injuries had been developing for years. I needed to take action that would disrupt Dad's control and create real change in Mom's situation, but I needed to do it in a way that prioritized her safety and autonomy rather than just satisfying my own need to see justice done. The plan I was beginning to formulate would require precise timing, comprehensive documentation, and careful coordination with people who had experience dealing with complex abuse cases. It would also require me to use skills I'd learned in the military police for purposes I'd never anticipated when I first chose that career path. I spent my last night at home carefully organizing all the evidence I'd gathered into a comprehensive file. Financial documents showing Dad's systematic theft of marital assets. Social media screenshots documenting his relationship with another woman. Business records revealing hidden accounts and property purchases. Medical documentation of Mom's injuries, which I'd photographed with her permission after explaining that they might be useful if she ever decided to seek legal help. The folder represented months of deception and years of financial manipulation. More importantly, it represented a pattern of abuse that was likely to continue and escalate unless something disrupted Dad's control over the situation. I also prepared a separate file of resources for Mom, contact information for legal aid organizations, domestic violence advocates, financial advisors who specialized in helping women regain economic independence, and counseling services. I wasn't sure when or if she'd be ready to use these resources, but I wanted her to know they were available. Before leaving, I had one more conversation with Mom about practical safety measures. Did she have access to emergency cash? Did she have a safe place to stay if she ever felt threatened? Did she know how to contact police or domestic violence advocates if she needed help immediately? Her answers were concerning, but not surprising. She had limited access to cash beyond her household expense account. She hadn't considered the possibility of needing alternative housing arrangements. She'd never thought about contacting authorities for help with domestic problems because she didn't really think of her situation as domestic violence. Things aren't that bad, she said when I gently suggested she might want to explore her options. Your father isn't a terrible person, he's just going through something right now. This phase will pass. I didn't argue with her assessment, but I left the resource information anyway, telling her it was just general information she might find useful sometime. I also made sure she had my contact information and understood that she could call me anytime, for any reason, without worrying about bothering me or interrupting my military duties. Driving back to base, I felt like I was abandoning her to a situation I understood better than she did. But I'd also learned enough about domestic violence dynamics to know that forcing someone to acknowledge their situation before they're ready often makes things worse rather than better. Mom needed to reach her own conclusions about Dad's behavior and make her own decisions about how to respond. However, that didn't mean I had to wait passively for her to figure things out. While respecting her autonomy, I could still take action to disrupt Dad's control and create consequences for his behavior that might force him to change his approach. The plan I'd developed required precise timing and coordination with several people who had professional expertise in legal and financial matters. I'd need to move quickly once I returned to duty, because Dad's social media posts suggested he was planning to extend his current vacation indefinitely. 2 weeks after returning to base, I received a call from Mom that confirmed my worst fears. She'd fallen again, she said, this time down the basement stairs. More bruises, a possible concussion, and she was calling to let me know she might not be answering her phone regularly for a few days while she recovered. The timing wasn't coincidental. Dad's social media had gone quiet for several days, then resumed with posts from the same marina where he kept his yacht. He'd been home briefly long enough to hurt Mom again, then returned to his vacation as if nothing had happened. That night, I made the phone calls I'd been preparing for weeks. Sarah connected me with a military legal officer who specialized in domestic violence cases involving civilian family members. A civilian attorney who handled divorce cases with hidden assets agreed to review my documentation. A private investigator with experience in financial fraud cases offered to help gather additional evidence. Within 72 hours, I had a team of professionals who understood the scope of Dad's abuse and were prepared to take coordinated action. The military legal officer helped me understand how to document everything properly for potential criminal charges. The divorce attorney explained how to protect Mom's interests in civil proceedings. The private investigator began tracing Dad's financial activities and building a comprehensive picture of his asset manipulation. I also contacted local domestic violence advocates near Mom's home and asked them to do a welfare check without revealing my connection to the situation. They visited her as part of their community outreach program, ostensibly to provide information about their services to all women in the neighborhood. She accepted their literature politely and didn't reveal her injuries, but she now had their contact information and knew help was available if she decided she wanted it. The most difficult decision was whether to take direct action against Dad or continue gathering evidence while trying to keep Mom safe. His pattern of violence was escalating, and his financial theft was becoming more sophisticated. Waiting for Mom to recognize the situation and seek help herself might take months or years, during which time she could be seriously injured or financially ruined. I decided that some situations require intervention regardless of whether the victim is ready to acknowledge they need help. Military training teaches you to act decisively when people's safety is at stake, even if they don't understand the danger they're facing. Dad's social media posts showed he was planning a major celebration with his girlfriend, their 2-year anniversary, apparently being commemorated with a month-long yacht trip through the Caribbean. While he was celebrating his systematic betrayal of his marriage, Mom was home recovering from injuries he'd probably caused, struggling to pay bills with money I was sending from my military salary. The contrast was so stark and the injustice so comprehensive that I knew I had to act. Not just to help Mom, but to ensure that Dad faced real consequences for years of calculated abuse. He'd been operating without accountability for too long, and that needed to change immediately. I put on my military police uniform before driving to the marina. Not for intimidation, though I hoped it would add weight to the moment, but because it reminded me who I'd become and what I was capable of when people I cared about were being harmed. The uniform represented years of training and investigation, evidence gathering, and strategic intervention. Today, I was going to use all of those skills. Dad's yacht was exactly where I'd expected to find it, and the marina was busy enough that my presence wouldn't seem unusual. I'd timed my arrival for mid-morning on a Wednesday, when most recreational boaters would be at work and the docks would be relatively quiet. His lawyer was waiting on the pier, exactly as I'd arranged. James Morrison had handled legal matters for Dad's business for over a decade, so he was familiar with Dad's professional activities and personal style. More importantly, he was an officer of the court with ethical obligations that would require him to take my documentation seriously. I handed him the folder I'd been preparing for weeks. "Tell him to open it alone," I said. "And make sure he understands that copies of everything are already in the hands of appropriate authorities." Morrison looked curious, but not concerned. He probably thought this was some kind of business matter, maybe a contract dispute or financial disagreement that could be resolved through negotiation. He had no idea he was about to deliver evidence of systematic domestic violence and financial fraud to his client. "I'll make sure he gets it immediately," Morrison said. "Should I tell him you'll be waiting for a response?" "No," I replied. "He'll know how to reach me if he has questions." I walked back to my car and waited. From the parking area, I had a clear view of the yacht and could see when Morrison boarded and located Dad. Through binoculars, I watched him hand over the folder and explain that it had come from me with instructions to review it privately. Dad took the folder casually, probably expecting business documents or family news that Morrison was delivering as a courtesy. He disappeared into the yacht's cabin with the folder, while Morrison waited on deck and Dad's girlfriend continued sunbathing, apparently unaware that anything significant was happening. 10 minutes later, Dad burst out of the cabin looking like he'd seen a ghost. His face was completely white, and he was moving with the kind of frantic energy that suggests someone has just realized they're in serious trouble. He said something urgent to Morrison, who looked confused and concerned. Then he said something to his girlfriend that made her sit up and start asking questions. Dad ignored her questions and jumped from the yacht to the dock, still carrying the folder. He ran toward the parking area without looking back, moving like someone who was running away from something rather than toward something. He got into his car and drove away fast enough to leave rubber marks on the asphalt. I waited another few minutes to see what would happen next. Morrison was talking to Dad's girlfriend, apparently trying to explain what had just occurred without having much information himself. She was getting increasingly agitated, demanding to know where Dad had gone and what was in the folder that had upset him so dramatically. Eventually, Morrison left the yacht and walked to his own car, looking puzzled and concerned. The girlfriend stayed on deck, making phone calls and pacing around like she was trying to figure out what to do next. Nobody was celebrating anymore. I drove home satisfied that the first phase of my plan had been successful. Dad had received comprehensive documentation of his domestic violence, financial fraud, and systematic deception. He now knew that multiple people were aware of his behavior and that evidence of his crimes was being preserved by authorities who could take action against him. More importantly, he knew that his double life was no longer secret. His girlfriend would start asking questions he couldn't answer honestly. Morrison would be obligated to advise him about his legal exposure. Other people in his business and social circles would gradually learn about his behavior as legal proceedings began. The folder I'd given Morrison contained everything Dad needed to understand his situation: financial records showing his theft of marital assets, medical documentation of Mom's injuries, social media evidence of his affair, and sworn statements from witnesses who'd observed his behavior. It also contained copies of complaints that had already been filed with appropriate authorities and legal actions that were already being initiated. Dad's comfortable arrangements were about to become very uncomfortable. His financial assets were going to be frozen pending investigation of his fraud. His business relationships were going to be scrutinized by people who took domestic violence seriously. His girlfriend was going to learn about his marriage and his systematic abuse of his wife. But most importantly, Mom was going to be protected from further retaliation while she figured out how to rebuild her life. Domestic violence advocates were already monitoring her situation and providing resources. Legal representatives were already working to secure her financial interests. Medical professionals were already documenting her injuries in case criminal charges became appropriate. The plan wasn't just about exposing Dad's behavior or making him face consequences for his actions. It was about creating systematic changes that would give Mom the support and resources she needed to recover from years of abuse and rebuild her independence. I knew Dad would probably try to contact me directly, demanding explanations or attempting to negotiate some kind of resolution that would minimize his legal exposure. I was prepared for those conversations, but I wasn't interested in anything he might have to say about his behavior or his circumstances. People who systematically abuse their families for years don't get to control the timeline or terms of accountability when their behavior is finally exposed. Dad had spent years making unilateral decisions about Mom's safety, financial security, and emotional well-being. Now other people were going to make decisions about his future, and he was going to have to live with consequences he couldn't manipulate or escape. Word traveled fast. Within a week, Dad's business associates started distancing themselves from him as details of the domestic violence allegations became known. His assets were frozen pending investigation of the financial fraud charges. The yacht was impounded as potential evidence of money laundering and asset hiding. His girlfriend disappeared, apparently deciding that her relationship with a man facing criminal charges wasn't worth the complications. Mom called me 3 days after I delivered the folder to Morrison. Her voice was different, confused but not panicked, concerned but not defensive. "Honey, I don't understand what's happening," she said. "Your father's lawyer came by the house with some papers, and there are people calling about legal proceedings. Did you know anything about this?" I told her I'd been working with authorities to investigate financial irregularities in Dad's business affairs, which was true without being complete. I explained that she might be contacted by advocates and attorneys who wanted to help her understand her rights and options, and that she shouldn't feel pressured to make any immediate decisions about anything. "Am I in some kind of legal trouble?" she asked. "No, Mom. You're not in trouble. But you may be entitled to protections and resources you didn't know were available. There are people who can help you understand everything that's happening." Over the next few weeks, Mom began the slow process of learning about the extent of Dad's deception and abuse. Domestic violence advocates helped her recognize patterns she'd been minimizing or rationalizing for years. Financial advisors showed her how systematically her economic security had been undermined. Medical professionals documented her injuries and connected them to patterns of escalating violence. The hardest part for her wasn't learning about Dad's affair or his financial theft. The hardest part was accepting that her own assessment of her situation had been so thoroughly distorted by years of manipulation that she'd been unable to recognize the danger she was facing. "I kept thinking things would get better," she told me during one of our conversations. "I kept believing his explanations and making excuses for his behavior. I didn't realize how much I'd stopped trusting my own judgment about everything." That's how systematic abuse works. It doesn't just create immediate harm. It undermines the victim's ability to recognize harm, seek help, or trust their own perceptions of reality. Mom had been psychologically conditioned to accept unacceptable treatment and to blame herself for problems Dad was creating. Recovery from that kind of psychological manipulation takes time and professional support. Mom started working with a counselor who specialized in domestic violence recovery. She joined a support group for women who'd experienced financial abuse. She began the legal process of securing her rights to marital assets and protecting herself from further financial exploitation. Dad's attempts to contact her were blocked by legal protective orders and the domestic violence advocates who were coordinating her safety planning. He tried calling me several times, but I referred him to the attorneys who were handling the criminal charges and civil proceedings. I had nothing to say to him that wasn't better communicated through formal legal channels. The man who'd spent years controlling every aspect of our family's financial and emotional life suddenly found himself completely cut off from the people he'd been manipulating. His business collapsed as legal investigations revealed the extent of his fraudulent activities. His social relationships disappeared as people learned about his domestic violence. His romantic relationship ended when his girlfriend realized he'd been lying to her about everything. Most importantly, Mom was safe. The protective orders meant Dad couldn't contact her directly or come near the house. The frozen assets meant he couldn't continue stealing money from their joint accounts. The ongoing legal proceedings meant he was too busy dealing with his own problems to create new problems for her. For the first time in years, Mom could make decisions about her own life without worrying about Dad's retaliation or manipulation. She could pay bills without wondering whether he was stealing money from their accounts. She could leave the house without worrying about whether he might hurt her when she returned. The process wasn't easy or quick. Mom had to rebuild confidence in her own judgment, learn to trust her perceptions of reality, and develop new patterns of decision-making that weren't based on avoiding Dad's anger or manipulation. But she had professional support, legal protection, and financial resources that made recovery possible. I visited whenever I could get leave, helping with practical matters and providing emotional support as she navigated the complex process of rebuilding her life. But mostly, I watched her rediscover parts of herself that had been suppressed by years of systematic abuse. She started laughing again. Not the careful, measured responses she'd developed to manage Dad's moods, but genuine laughter that came from finding things genuinely funny. She started making plans that extended more than a few days into the future because she could finally count on her circumstances remaining stable long enough to follow through on commitments. A year later, Dad was living in another state, his business dissolved, the yacht long gone, and the woman from the photos nowhere to be seen. He'd pleaded guilty to domestic violence charges to avoid trial and received probation with strict conditions about contacting Mom. The financial fraud charges were resolved through asset forfeiture and restitution payments that restored most of the money he'd stolen from their joint accounts. Mom had found a part-time job she genuinely enjoyed at a local nonprofit that provided services to women recovering from domestic violence. The work was meaningful to her, and it connected her with other women who understood what she'd experienced. She'd become an advocate herself, helping other women recognize the signs of financial abuse and emotional manipulation. The house felt completely different when I visited. Lighter, somehow, as if someone had opened windows that had been sealed shut for years. Mom moved through rooms with confidence, made decisions without second-guessing herself, and talked about future plans without the careful qualification that had characterized her speech for so long. She'd started dating someone, a retired teacher she'd met through her volunteer work, who made her laugh and treated her with the kind of respect that should be normal, but had become foreign to her during her marriage to Dad. Their relationship was developing slowly, and she was learning to trust her own judgment about people again. "I never told you what was really in that folder you had delivered to your father," I said during one of my visits. She looked at me with curiosity, but not anxiety. I figured it was evidence of his financial activities and probably proof of his affair. Was there more? I explained about the medical documentation of her injuries, the financial records showing systematic theft, the social media evidence of his double life, and the sworn statements from witnesses who'd observed his behavior. I told her about the months of investigation and coordination with legal professionals and domestic violence advocates. She listened without interrupting, processing information about the extent of planning that had been required to disrupt Dad's control and protect her safety. "You did all of that for me," she said finally. It wasn't a question. "Someone had to," I replied. "He was never going to stop on his own, and you were too isolated to see all your options clearly." She was quiet for a while, thinking through the implications of what I'd told her. "Are you angry that I didn't ask your permission before taking action?" "No," she said. "I'm grateful that you saw what I couldn't see and did what I couldn't do. I'm grateful that you understood the situation better than I understood it myself, and that you cared enough to take risks to help me." We talked about boundaries and autonomy, about the difference between helping someone and making decisions for them. I'd been careful to take actions that created opportunities and resources for her rather than forcing specific choices. The legal protections, financial security, and professional support I'd arranged gave her options, but she'd made her own decisions about how to use those options. "What I learned," she continued, "is that sometimes the people who love you can see things you can't see about your own life. And sometimes accepting help isn't about giving up your independence, it's about getting your independence back." The most important lesson for me was understanding the difference between justice and revenge. I could have exposed Dad's behavior in ways designed to humiliate him publicly or cause maximum personal damage. I could have focused on making him suffer rather than on helping Mom recover. Instead, I'd focused on creating systematic changes that addressed the underlying problems, legal protections that prevented further abuse, financial arrangements that restored Mom's economic security, and professional support that helped her rebuild confidence in her own judgment. The consequences Dad faced were proportional to his behavior and focused on preventing future harm rather than inflicting punishment for past actions. Real justice isn't about making bad people suffer. It's about protecting vulnerable people and creating conditions that prevent harm from continuing. Dad's suffering was a byproduct of facing accountability for his actions, not the primary goal of the intervention. Some boundaries aren't about saying no. Sometimes they're about saying nothing and letting the truth speak for itself. Dad had spent years manipulating information and controlling narratives to maintain his double life. When comprehensive evidence of his behavior was presented to people who had the authority and expertise to address it appropriately, his ability to control the situation disappeared completely. The folder I'd handed to his lawyer contained no threats, no demands, no ultimatums. Just documentation of what he'd actually done, presented to people who were professionally obligated to respond appropriately. Dad's panicked reaction wasn't caused by anything I'd said or demanded. It was caused by his sudden realization that his carefully constructed lies had been thoroughly exposed. Truth has its own power when it's presented clearly and completely to people who are prepared to act on it responsibly. Sometimes the most effective intervention is simply ensuring that the right people have access to accurate information about what's really happening. I never told anyone exactly what was in that folder, except for Mom after she was ready to hear it. Some things are better left between the person who acts and the person who deserved protection. What mattered wasn't the specific details of Dad's exposure, but the fact that Mom was finally safe and free to rebuild her life according to her own values and priorities. The truth had spoken for itself, and justice had been served through systematic change rather than dramatic confrontation. Sometimes that's the most powerful kind of accountability: quiet, thorough, and focused on preventing future harm rather than inflicting punishment for past behavior. That was the day my father's double life ended, not with a fight, but with the truth in the right hands. My mom is finally safe, and I've learned that sometimes the quietest moves hit the hardest. Have you ever uncovered a secret that changed everything you thought you knew about someone? How did you handle it? Would you have confronted them, or let the evidence do the talking? Share your thoughts in the comments, hit like if you believe in standing up for those who can't, and subscribe for more true stories about justice, boundaries, and taking back your power.